In a city that was stitched back together in the long wake of the Second World War, where tenements rose like repaired quilts and storefronts became the visible seams between private life and public labor, a tiny bakery took root. If pressed for a founding year, I will not give you a single digit but a decade, the 1950s. That era, just after 1945, in the wake of demobilization and urban reconstruction, was when flour routinely dusted palms, when neighbors expected to be offered a slice of something warm, and when the credit extended across counters was as much social glue as it was accounting. The bakery did not spring fully formed from a bold plan. It arrived as a slow accretion, two people with calloused hands, modest savings, an oven that had been coaxed from second-hand parts, and a conviction that a livelihood could be made with heat and rhythm. That imprecise founding date matters. It signals that the shop was part of a broader communal recovery, born of thrift, reciprocity, and the ambient expectation that neighbors would cover for one another in hard times. This narrative attends to one small object, a folded slip of paper, and to the longer history it both emerged from and helped to shape. The envelope did not appear from nowhere. It carried the weight of precedent, decades of informal giving, the bookkeeping practices of a small shop that also had to keep its ovens fired and rent paid, and the intimate entanglements of a family who did their labor under a single roofline. If history is the intelligence of sequence, then the envelope belongs to a series whose first audible moments are the clack of early morning dough mixers and the steady ticking of a kitchen clock above a stove that counted out life in minutes of rising and resting. That slow domestic insistence was the metronome of everything that followed. I folded that small paper in the spring of 2004. The act was quiet, no lawyers, no public pronouncements, just a hand, an ink pen, and a decision made in the hush that follows a season of strain. The winter before, in late 2003, a parent had been hospitalized. The bills came not only in envelopes but in the heavy, altering ways that surgery and prolonged care change routines and obligations. A funeral in January 2004 closed one chapter of that strain and opened another. Grief rearranged priorities and exposed the fragility of improvisational generosity. We were also feeling early tremors of an economic shift that would, by late 2008, expand into global crisis. In 2004 those tremors were visible as rising prices, tighter margins, and a sense that goodwill alone might not inhabit the architectural supports of a family business. The paper I folded was not a legal instrument, it was a moral covenant condensed to a line or two and placed between recipes, coffee cake and lemon curd, because the cookbook was where household knowledge lived. The date mattered because it located that decision among a cluster of events, a hospitalization, a funeral, and the slow heating of economic pressure. It made the act legible, not lofty. To explain that paper, and why a tiny folded slip could reshape a household, I must tell the story of a family and of a shop that was workplace, public square, and slow educational institution. In the 1960s and 1970s, the bakery was more than commerce. It was neighborhood life made tangible. My father, the baker, more than a name, a role that carried the rhythms of the shop, had a generosity that felt instinctive. He would give loaves to strikers, tuck a bun into the hands of a child who hadn't the coins, run a tab for an elderly customer always the last to pay, and scribble IOUs that rarely received strict accounting. Those acts, in those decades, did not necessarily imperil the shop. Costs were different. The local economy permitted a margin for neighborly lapses. A communal bank of favors, neighbors lending a hand, cousins offering labor during harvest weeks, a church raising a modest fund, offset occasional holes in the books. Those obligations were social and moral promises as much as financial ones. That social bank eroded slowly and then more abruptly with each passing decade. By the 1980s and into the 1990s the landscape shifted, ingredients cost more, rents escalated, utilities became recurring threats to a thin bottom line. National policy trends and global markets mattered in the ways they leaked into local life. Stagflation and oil shocks in the 1970s, the deregulation and market-driven policies of the 1980s, the globalization currents of the 1990s. Each pushed the arithmetic of small retail into tighter confines. The bakery learned what many family enterprises learn the hard way: goodwill does not pay invoices. My sibling and I grew up bound by shared mornings in the shop and by very different instincts about how charity should be practiced within a family. He believed, with theater and performance, that dignity was often restored by surprise gestures. An unexpected check, an unannounced gift could serve as an affirmation of being seen. I believed something quieter, that kindness without structure could become a slow erosion, like heat leaking from an oven door, and that some bureaucratic scaffolding, ledgers, limits, and sometimes legal instruments, was necessary to preserve the house for another generation. The crystallizing moment that turned private conversation into practice came in the winter of 2003. The parents' hospitalization revealed that our habitual improvisations were insufficient. Medical bills arrived, creditors inched closer, and oral promises felt thin against the weight of invoices. In the weeks after the funeral in January 2004, while the city sat under a winter that made ovens feel like hearths and hierarchies alike, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote. The slip of paper I folded in March 2004 was not drafted in anger but in the quiet exhaustion that follows repeated giving and the slow accrual of risk. It was a private covenant. It consolidated what had been a conversation strung in fragments, limits designed to preserve the family, safeguards to make generosity sustainable. The kitchen where that envelope later surfaced, where my child would find it, was itself a palimpsest of family history. The cookbook in which the paper lived was a heavy volume, its spine softened by flour and years of being opened to the same pages. Clippings were tucked between chapters, a newspaper recipe from the late 1970s about flaky pie crust, a half-faded photocopy of a wedding cake order from the 1980s, my mother's notes on yeast temperatures in a script that crossed decades. The physicality of these objects mattered. They were tactile anchors in a household that blurred private and public life. In 2008, when my daughter discovered the envelope by accident, reaching for a lemon curd notation and feeling the paper's sharp corner. She was about 18, old enough to ask hard questions but still young enough to take answers without the full burden of consequence. The timing was uncanny. 2008 would soon become the year when a wider economic tremor expanded into a full-blown financial crisis, and the principles that had seemed private to us suddenly had broader applicability. What I remember of that conversation is less the exact wording than the tone. I could have sidestepped. I could have joked, or hidden the paper further. Instead I chose to speak plainly, using the kitchen's domestic cadence as an ethical language. I told my daughter, in the quiet light that falls across countertops, that love was not synonymous with limitless giving, that sometimes the capacity to care required firm boundaries, not as punishment but as preservation. She asked, with the bluntness children are permitted, whether my parents had been sad. I told her yes. I told her that part of mourning is recognizing that grief and prudence are often entangled. Sometimes the right thing requires imposing a rule that looks cold from the outside. This conversation, in the spring of 2008, became a formative lesson. It put into words what the paper had been meant for, a way to teach practices that could persist beyond a single set of mistakes. The conversation moved from theory to practice within a year. In late spring of 2009, when my daughter asked for a bicycle, we sat not in judgment but in negotiation. We took a ledger and an aging calculator to the kitchen table. We listed chores, assigned time commitments, set milestones, and wrote down the expected timeline. We made penalties and rewards visible. In June 2009 the bike arrived, celebrated not as a free gift but as a negotiated and fulfilled plan. Neighbors who had watched the child through the years clapped. A small photo was taken and tacked to the fridge. The bicycle's arrival became a ceremonial moment. The lesson embodied was that discipline can be a form of love. The plan reiterated the envelope's ethic in a way that a paper alone could not, because the young person had participated in the choreography of earning, had kept to milestones, and had learned the worth of delayed gratification. Adolescence complicated the house's new order, as adolescence does. Tests came that were foreseeable and others that were not. In the winter holiday season of 2007, before the bicycle negotiation but after the envelope itself, my brother handed a check to a cousin who had been excluded from a family plan, contravening the rules we had been working to uphold. We argued in a parked car outside a grocery store, winter wind cutting the warmth of our words. He described the small, immediate joy on our parents' faces. I recounted the creeping dread of enabling ruin. He cried. I listened. There was no neat resolution that night. Our dispute marked an inflection. Sibling dynamics would shape how we put practices into motion, and no single approach would satisfy everyone. Over time, a division of labor emerged, an imperfect and negotiated compromise that allowed different instincts to breathe. My brother became, in effect, the household's minister of immediate comforts. Small cakes, surprise movie nights, the occasional unplanned gift. Acts that smoothed grief and supplied short-term joy. I took on structural responsibilities, organizing accounts, talking to accountants, consulting lawyers when needed. The division required constant renegotiation but proved durable. It permitted the coexistence of tenderness and prudence without forcing either into an absolute posture. Medical emergencies in the household continued. In autumn 2011, a longtime family friend, who had historically been a recipient of informal assistance, faced a sudden medical crisis requiring immediate, expensive treatment. Our memories and obligations to this person were long and mixed, favors unreturned, occasional dependency, love threaded with exasperation. We deliberated as families must, attempting to hold many truths at once. The choice we made was pragmatic. We offered funds, but formalized the assistance. The help was accompanied by receipts, a repayment schedule realistic to the friend's earning capacity, and a clause to convert the loan into a grant if evidence emerged of sustained effort toward fiscal responsibility. This compromise was neither unalloyed generosity nor punitive accounting. It preserved both life and household fabric. There were moral agonies in such decisions. Who is entitled to mercy, and who to discipline? Is putting conditions on help a kind of cruelty? Or is it, as I came to believe, a method for preserving both the individual and the household? I thought often of early mornings when my father had slipped coins to a boy he had employed, and I wondered if I had become habitually cautious. The calculus was narrow. The family could absorb finite risk without imperiling the bakery. Compassion, in our experience, had to coexist with structure. Therapy, in 2005, played a critical role in clarifying motive. A therapist asked me, with the bluntness that therapy sometimes requires, whether the paper had ever felt like revenge. I had to be honest. There were nights when the paper did shine as an instrument of recompense, an answer to younger versions of my parents who had once left us uncompensated. Therapy helped me disentangle chastisement from preservation. It taught me to mourn the rituals my decisions had altered without letting that mourning become a rationale for punitive restrictions. The paper remained what it had been meant to be, a preservation tool. Therapy demanded that I check the ledger of my motives regularly. Boundary setting is ethical work that requires ongoing reflection. The bakery itself was the daily crucible where these ideas were tested. One winter morning in 2006, our main oven burner failed. The manager, an unshowy, steady man with flour in the recesses of his knuckles and a habit of keeping a ledger in his apron pocket, called to ask whether to draw from reserves or to cover the repair from operational funds. The question was more than fiscal. It tested whether we were supporting a viable enterprise or subsidizing a model that could no longer stand. The decision to dip into reserves carried moral weight. It implied confidence in future capacity. The decision to balk risked immediate operational failure. We repaired the oven. When it came back to life, it became a small emblem of our method. We would nurture the machine when necessary to preserve the capacity to produce. These quotidian choices taught me to conceive of generosity as maintenance. Like oiling a hinge, generous acts require periodic attention lest a larger collapse occur. We instituted basic bureaucratic practices, separate accounts for operations and reserves, a modest emergency fund for true emergencies, and a policy that extraordinary withdrawals required documented cause. Those measures felt bureaucratic at first, and to some neighbors they seemed cold. Over time, however, they became recognizable as care, a form of neighborliness that prevented the slow attrition of resources through habitual improvisation. Some of the most human lessons came through small, humane experiments. In the winter of 2010, a regular customer lost his heat. He had for years relied on our forbearance, asking for credit enough that a pattern had emerged. The manager proposed a modest compromise. He could have a loaf of bread each day in exchange for a small cleaning job, thereby preserving dignity through work. The man accepted. Over months he repaid his debt partially in cash and partially by returning to patterns of participation, bringing friends who purchased bread, showing up on slow afternoons to sweep the flour from tables. The exchange was not theater. It was a pragmatic hybrid of charity and labor that restored habits more reliably than unilateral gifts had in the past. This microtransactional approach, work in exchange for sustenance, produced more durable outcomes than unilateral transfers had tended to. There were lonely consequences to the practice of limit setting. There were nights when I imagined the small acts of mercy I had denied, exceptions that might have altered a life in an unquantifiable way. An older regular, who had watched the shop and its choices for decades, once told me over coffee that I looked like a man who had given up something he had wanted to keep. I admitted that I had surrendered not only a habit but a comforting myth, the idea of untroubled parental love that could be met with indefinite largesse. The trade-off was real. In exchange for that myth, I gained a rough, pragmatic freedom, less simmering resentment and more capacity to sustain the household in the long run. The grief of that surrender never disappeared, it became structured. Time taught another lesson: inheritance is not only the accrual of assets but the transmission of habits. By the mid-2010s my child had matured into an adult who had, through repeated practice, absorbed the family's ethics. In 2016 we sat down and wrote a short list, a letter of values, with phrases like honesty about limits, respect for labor, and a commitment to help with a plan. We tucked that list into the cookbook, next to my mother's yeast notes and the pie crust clipping. The list was a ritual object rather than a legal instrument. It framed family expectations in prose rather than rules, offering a shared language that made compassionate restraint intelligible to the next generation. The child learned to count change, sweep the shop during busy hours, and to call me out when I slipped back into older rescue patterns. The bicycle we had bought in June 2009 remained a small emblem of how habits form the basis of character. Watching this ethic pass on, enacted rather than preached, has been one of the quiet satisfactions of a life of small interventions. Practical instruments, the modest trusts and trustees I recommended in community workshops, became part of the vocabulary I offered in public settings. By 2010 to 2013 neighbors had started asking how to do this work with their own families, and I began speaking at community centers and church basements. I described arrangements that were administratively simple and emotionally savvy: small trusts managed by someone outside the immediate family to minimize conflict, emergency loan arrangements with clear documentation, and rituals that made the rules less shaming and more dignified. I did not proclaim a universal creed, I offered a language for making hard choices visible. The community talks were instructive for what they revealed about popular moral imaginaries. Some listeners welcomed limits as freeing, others bristled, interpreting boundary-making as withholding. A young woman told me bluntly that my approach deprived her of the moral cover she needed to keep pouring herself into parents who refused to accept help. Another neighbor, a single parent, adopted a conditional fund idea and later sent a quiet note of thanks describing how it had kept her from making a ruinous, long-term sacrifice. These small public pedagogies did not transform the neighborhood overnight, but they seeded conversations about where love ends and sustainability begins. Practical rules hardened as heuristics developed from repeated failure and ironic success. Separate business and household accounts. A modest emergency fund that required evidence for extraordinary withdrawals. Matching programs where the household's contribution was conditional on the recipient's demonstrable effort. These were not rigid doctrines but tools refined through experience. We discovered painfully that too much oversight could feel punitive and that too little oversight could be enabling. One cousin, subject to relapse, tested our experiments. We co-signed loans that were misused. We tried matching programs that sometimes motivated and sometimes failed with humiliating speed. Each failure required rethinking. The only consistent posture was responsiveness: admit error, redesign, and try again. Therapy, community dialogue, and the bakery's daily work all pointed to a recurring theme: compassion must be coupled with structures that preserve dignity and capacity. Where earlier generations might have relied entirely on ad hoc favors and unrecorded debts, the shifting economic landscape of the late 20th and early 21st centuries demanded forms of accountability that made help sustainable without turning kindness into punishment. The small paper I folded in March 2004 was one such form, an attempt to articulate limits so that generosity could endure. Death remained the sternest test of these arrangements. When the older parent died in 2014, funerals compressed sorrow and judgment into intense hours. People told stories that sometimes functioned as moral verdicts. The structures we had put in place, trusts, documentation, and prearranged plans, did not make grief gentler, but they insulated mourning from procedural warfare. Wills and designated accounts allowed administrators to execute plans without turning the funeral into a battleground. That procedural relief felt, in its own small way, like vindication for planning, not triumph but the facilitation of mourning. The envelope's influence spilled into broader civic experiments. By 2013, neighbors began to assemble modest mutual aid funds with simple rules and to convene workshops where legal basics and humility exercises met. Local meetings, held in community centers, libraries, and church basements, combined plain-language legal guidance with storytelling. Residents told messy family stories in a room where limits were not shaming but practical. Leaders of these groups were a patchwork: social workers, volunteers, and neighbors who had learned from their own failures. Their approach was pragmatic. They emphasized ritual over secrecy, naming expectations, asking for receipts with empathy, and constructing visible pathways for repair. Success was not measured in the perfection of legal language, but in the ordinariness of repeated acts that preserved dignity without eliminating accountability. One of the most humane developments in these civic spaces was the turn from secrecy to ritual. Instead of covert checks passed under napkins, assistance began to be marked with quiet ceremonies: a handwritten letter explaining the aid, a small public acknowledgement followed by a structured repayment plan, or an invitation to exchange labor for sustenance. These rituals did not erase humiliation, they softened it. They allowed recipients to accept help as something with social form and recognition, rather than as an unspoken confession. Rituals transformed accountability into choreography. Parallel to these civic experiments, there were tender, irreplaceable moments that no piece of paper could predict. In 2012, my mother, lucid during a rare afternoon, asked simply for presents rather than money. She wanted to tell stories about the bakery's origins, how ovens had been built on hope, how neighbors had lent a hand in the earliest lean years. Those sessions were gifts built on the scaffolding we had erected, the paper and the practices carved out time and emotional space so memory could be honored. The daily work of managing cash flow and calibrating assistance had created the bandwidth to sit and listen. In such afternoons, the bakery felt like a repository of things beyond currency: stories, rituals, and a living archive of small human acts. The paper itself remains where I placed it, not as a talisman to be brandished but as a quiet, tangible reminder. Its margin bears a faint smudge from a pen that hesitated on damp, anxious hands, an artifact whose mark is as meaningful to me as any clause in a contract. That smudge recalls the mixture of doubt and resolve in March 2004. I retrieve the envelope occasionally, after a funeral, after a family dispute, when neighbors ask practical questions, and each time it operates as a ritual of recalibration. It tells me what I have agreed to hold, that love can be fierce and finite, that a no can be the form of a truest yes, and that care sometimes requires limits to be sustainable. If someone asks me today what counsel I would give before they draft their own small covenant, I offer advice refined from decades of practice. Place limits as channels for repair rather than final bars. Enforce boundaries with humility. Provide avenues back to dignity. Include exceptions for emergencies but require participation, work, documentation, or matched contributions, for recurring support. Think about trustees who can implement decisions without becoming embroiled in family politics. Create rituals that allow help to be given without shame. Above all, remember that boundaries are rarely substitutes for love, they are often its scaffolding. There were moments of community pressure to divulge the envelope's exact language. Gossip and curiosity can turn private ethics into spectacle. I refused to disclose the text, not because I believed in secrecy for its own sake, but because exact wording mattered only insofar as it protected the household. When neighbors pressed, I translated intention into principle rather than exposition: how to combine modest legal forms with emotional practices that preserve dignity. My talks were not sermons, they were case studies in practical ethics, an argument that the messy life of a neighborhood required hybrid solutions. Practically, the shop taught hard lessons. Emergency funds must be reserved for true emergencies, not serve as slush. Separate ledgers and accounts prevent well-meaning gestures from morphing into patterns that threaten an enterprise. Bureaucracy, in this instance, served as compassion, it prevented error and relapse. Lessons that once felt cold grew to look like stewardship. Failure, of course, remained inevitable. Relapses occurred. Plans faltered. One cooperative table we set for interfamily lending collapsed under old habits and resentments. The critical skill was not perfection but the willingness to redesign, to be responsive and humane in the face of new evidence. Rigidity would have been cruelty. Responsiveness allowed the process to remain moral. When the older parent's body finally required the formalities of probate and funerary rites in 2014, the arrangements we had made did not eliminate sorrow, but they reduced the procedural fighting that can turn grief into a partisan business. Wills, prearranged accounts, and designated trustees made the legal matters lighter. That practical relief felt like vindication for planning, not a theatrical victory, but a facilitation of mourning. The modest civic experiments we seeded produced a ripple effect. Neighbors learned to ask for limits. They formed small emergency funds with simple paperwork and trained volunteers to help others articulate plans combining compassion and fiscal sense. By the mid-2010s, these groups had become modest laboratories of civic ethics, rehearsal spaces for humane governance rather than legislatures of morality. They helped people ask hard questions without the corrosive charge of shame. One of the most humane innovations we observed was ritualized help. A modest envelope with a handwritten note, a small ceremony marking receipt, or a public articulation of a plan made accepting support less humiliating. Rituals required accountability without turning love into punishment. They altered the moral texture of generosity so that receiving help did not equate with moral bankruptcy. As my child reached adulthood, the letter of values tucked inside the cookbook became less a sentimental relic and more a shorthand for practice. It contained practical rules, honesty about limits, respect for labor, willingness to help with a plan, and a commitment to preserve pride. Seeing that ethic enacted by the next generation is one of the quiet satisfactions of my life. It taught me that the paper's legacy is not cash but language, habit, and the social choreography that makes sustained care possible. If I must stake a single claim about the life that grew from that tiny paper, it is this: boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are its sustainability. Limits prevent immediate gratifications that undermine future stability and insist that generosity be practiced in a way that does not create fresh dependencies. This is not a romantic conclusion. It is a claim forged in the slow daily grind of running ovens, counting change, soothing parents, arguing with siblings, and rebuilding after failure. On late spring mornings now, when light spills through the bakery windows and the bell above the door rings with a familiar insistence, my child darts through the swinging door with a laugh that is both ours and uniquely theirs. Customers come for small domestic needs: a loaf for dinner, a sweet for a child's lunch, a cake for a modest celebration. The cookbook rests on its shelf. The envelope lies where it has always been, between the lemon curd notes and the coffee cake recipe. When I take it out now and then, I remember the debates, sibling rows on cold nights, the awkward consultations with lawyers and accountants in the autumn of 2004 and subsequent years, the soft calls to parents that often ended in tears, and the therapy that forced me to examine motive. The paper contains a landscape of compromises, failures, and cautious triumphs. It is not a tidy story of victory, but a lived account of how caring can be made to endure. There will always be people who equate love with limitless giving and those who call limits cold. But in the quiet economy of daily life, where bread is baked and bills are paid, where children learn the grammar of work and affection, creating space for responsibility is often the most tender act. Saying no, sometimes, opens a path for someone else to become a person who can say yes without losing themselves. So the paper stays where it is. Each time I take it out, I feel again the mixture of burden and blessing that the decision in March 2004 entailed. I recall the nights of argument, the consultations, the small embarrassing phone calls, and the many conversations with a child who asked plainly what it means to love responsibly. That single fold contains a history, not perfect, filled with compromises and failures, but lived. In that living I find the most honest account of what caring can look like when it is meant to endure. After 10 years of practice, the small rituals and the ledger lines accrued into a pattern that could be read like a civic biography. In the winter of 2016, I found myself invited to a neighborhood meeting a block away, where a cramped community room smelled of coffee and last summer's flyers. A woman in her 50s stood at the front and, with obvious relief, described how she had handed a laminated sheet, the script we had adapted from my envelope, across her kitchen table to an adult son who had been oscillating between promises and crises for the better part of a decade. She described the first night he slept in a sober bed after the agreement, and the tentative reconciliation that followed. A social worker in the back noted that what we were doing felt like a form of harm reduction for families, not removing care but bounding it in ways that made sustained caregiving possible. By 2017, these practices had migrated into other institutions. A neighborhood clinic asked us to run a short workshop on accountable aid for case managers. A small foundation in the city commissioned a modest paper about how formalistic tools could support relational work. We were careful with language. We spoke of covenants, not contracts, and of rituals that preserved face. In late 2018, after a municipal initiative to support small enterprises in low-income corridors, a city clerk requested copies of the forms we used so that an immigrant assistance center could adapt them to multiple languages. None of this felt like a sweeping policy victory. It was, instead, the slow accretion of practice. 6 families adopting similar envelopes on one block, 3 churches piloting a ritual form for distributing benevolence checks, a food pantry experimenting with signed agreements that asked recipients to contribute an hour of service in exchange for recurring aid. These were small numbers in aggregate, but collectively they shifted expectations about what help looked like in our part of town. My own household continued to test the limits of those practices. The surviving parent, widowed after the probate in 2014, lived into the late 2010s with a stubborn desire for autonomy that mixed with intermittent need. There were afternoons in 2019 when she called and asked for help much in the way she had in 2012, presence rather than money, but there were also crises that strained the rules. A broken hip in early 2019 required convalescent care that was beyond the budget of a bakery that still had more charm than profit. The envelope's clauses were explicit. Emergency exceptions existed, but they required a plan, a trustee's sign-off, and, where possible, matched contributions. When lawyers drew up the formal addendum that March, the clause that caused the most friction allowed for a temporary suspension of certain limits for medical emergencies, contingent on repayment or labor contributions within a time horizon. What I had thought of as a humane bridge became, in practice, a point of negotiation that forced all involved to tell their practical truths. Those negotiations were not devoid of humiliation. There were nights when the surviving parent, once robust and in youth, a force in the bakery's earliest days, would ask over the telephone if the envelope could be set aside, if the child who now ran the oven would make an exception. On one of those nights, in April 2019, the conversation ended with the parent saying plainly, "I didn't think I would be the one asking." There is a specific kind of shame that arrives when roles reverse. Parents who counseled and commanded now had to ask. Children who were once recipients of instruction became guardians of limits. But shame, we discovered, is also a language that can be translated. We responded with ritual. The trustee, an old neighbor who had been present at many of our community meetings, came to the house. We sat at the kitchen table where once the disownment papers had been discussed in March 2004 and later where my own envelope had been placed. We read aloud, not to police but to witness. The parent asked to be included, not to be privileged. The trustee set terms, a timetable for rehabilitation, home visits by a community nurse, a modest stipend contingent on participation in physical therapy. We gave a small ceremony, a cup of tea, a folded note, and the ritual made the exchange bearable. The real test of the covenant came in 2020. Like many small businesses, the bakery faced the twin shocks of a public health crisis and the sudden collapse of regular foot traffic. In March 2020, when the city issued its first closures, we had to shutter for 2 weeks and then operate on significantly reduced capacity. The emergency clause in our practices was pulled out like an old map. We invoked the small reserves that had been set aside precisely for such moments, and we applied the tempering language of reciprocity. Customers on furlough were permitted to take home a loaf in exchange for a written note describing how they intended to earn it back, and older neighbors were offered scheduled deliveries supervised by volunteers who filled out receipts. The rituals that had once seemed quaint became logistical necessities. We created a short template: date, name, reason, commitment to repay in labor or funds by a specified date, and we handed envelopes with kindness and structure. The neighborhood food pantry began to use our model in weeknight distributions. What had been an act of moral engineering in 2004 revealed itself in 2020 to be an infrastructure for emergency solidarity. Those months also revealed moral complexities I had not fully anticipated. The surviving parents' trust fund, modest as it was, became a source of methodical friction. Extended family members, who had been peripheral critics, became activists in the wrong sense, arguing that our limits were cruel when money could be diverted. The argument always returned to the same point: who bears the responsibility for the future? I would sometimes repeat, defensively and softly, the argument we had rehearsed in community rooms. Unlimited giving risks dissolving agencies. Visible conditions preserve dignity by allowing people to participate in their own support. For every person who nodded, another would ask if we were simply imposing austerity. The measure of success was not unanimity but sustainability. If the bakery closed because we had exhausted resources trying to be magnanimous, then everyone would have lost. By the end of 2021, the economy had shifted again. The bakery limped back to a more normal cadence as customers returned. Some of our emergency adaptations remained permanent: a scheduled delivery system for elders, a small volunteer roster that handled errands, and a modest sliding scale policy for those with chronic instability. The neighborhood groups continued to meet, sometimes in person, sometimes over video, and they shared stories that were at once practical and terrible. A brother who refused to accept limits and wandered into ruin, a sister who used returned payments to start a small clothing repair business, a neighbor who finally found housing after a year on a waiting list. The small numbers, 4 or 5 people helped through structured aid, felt less like a drop in the ocean and more like a proof of concept. Incremental changes could alter life trajectories in ways that were measurable and humane. In 2022, a journalist from a local paper asked to write a profile of our work. I was skeptical. Publicity, we had learned, can distort nuance into moral theater. Still, a measured piece ran in October, describing the envelope as a local covenant, and it prompted letters, some praising, some accusing. One letter, from a woman in a nearby county, described how she had used our template to negotiate with an aging parent who refused to see a doctor. Your form, she wrote, gave me the courage to insist that care be accompanied by dignity. That sentence lodged with me. The envelope had never been only a legal or financial device, it had been a grammar for speech, a way of articulating the painful sentence, I love you, but I cannot ruin myself. Yet the story's trajectory was not only outward. Internally, the family's emotional architecture shifted in ways subtle and durable. My child, who had been a teenager when I first wrote the rules, now in 2023 balanced the bakery's books with a rigorous tenderness. They instituted a monthly review where the family, those still active in the bakery and the trustee, would sit for an hour and read receipts, review aid, and decide what to do. The ritual was precise: tea, minutes taken, a public note of thanks for any neighbor labor, and a short acknowledgement when an exception was made. It made the work of saying no less arbitrary and the work of saying yes more deliberate. Even so, there were moments that pierced the logic, the times when a parent, now older, used the rhetoric of despair to try to make limits crumble. In the autumn of 2023, after a particularly bad bout of insomnia, the surviving parent called late at night and begged not in the way of a request but as if the paper itself were an affront. You don't understand how terrifying it is, she said. She asked, for the first time in years, to be absolved of the forms, to be allowed the care she had not previously asked for. There was anger in her voice, then a kind of childlike pleading that exposed decades of role inversion. The trustee and I met the next day. We decided, collectively, to open a short-term exception that required a commitment to join a neighborhood elders group and to participate in a weekly program that connected retirees with modest work opportunities. The clause worked because it was mutual. It preserved the parent's dignity by offering contribution, and it preserved the bakery's viability by limiting the duration and scope of support. The envelope's life in this period was less a single text and more a family of practices. We amended, annotated, and ceremonially renewed it every few years. In March 2024, 20 years after that first smudged pen mark, we sat at the table and read the document aloud again. The smudge in the margin had faded but was visible like a scar. We added a new section addressing digital emergencies, passwords placed with the trustee for access to accounts, a clause about telemedicine facilitation, and a provision for climate-related disruptions. Small things that no one could have predicted when the first version was drafted. The process of revisiting the paper was itself a ritual of continuity. We invited neighbors, we brought a plain chocolate cake. People who had once been adversaries sat together to witness the renewal. The act of revision made the covenant feel alive rather than static. During the same year, the city offered a modest grant to support small enterprise resilience. We used a portion of the funds to host a 3-day workshop in June 2024 called Structures for Sustainable Care. Attendees were drawn from nearby neighborhoods, a mix of social workers, pastors, artisans, and a few curious city employees. We taught the practical steps: how to draft an accessible covenant, how to identify trustees, how to design rituals that preserved dignity. We also insisted on the darker lessons: the inevitability of failure, the moral costs of rigidity, the need for repair mechanisms. At the end of the 3rd day, a retired teacher who had sat through the whole workshop folded a small card and handed it to me. "We used your model," she said. "It kept my sister from losing her apartment." She cried for a moment, more from relief than sorrow. Those modest, concrete outcomes accumulated like the ledgers in our back office, small, ledgered acts of prevention that prevented the collapse of more expensive public remedies. And yet the paper could not anticipate every human turn. In early 2025, a former employee, someone who had been at the bakery for a dozen years and whom we had helped through a period of addiction a decade earlier, returned with a new set of needs. The old covenant had provisions for relapse and re-entry, match labor contributions with staged cash assistance, but the scale this time was different. The person needed medical care that exceeded our capacity and did not fit neatly into the previously agreed-upon clauses. We convened the trustee, a local social worker, and the friend's family. The conversation that followed was painful and familiar: debates about responsibility, the limits of small charities, the moral hazard of unconditional interventions. We offered what we could: a small emergency fund, a space to work part-time as they re-entered sobriety, an agreement that the city clinic would manage the medical case. It was imperfect. The person's gratitude was mixed with resentment. The renewed dependence tested every principle we had laid down since 2004. Throughout these episodes, the envelope retained its role as a mnemonic device. It reminded us of March 2004 and of the reluctance that must accompany resolve. It anchored practices in an ethics that refused both cruelty and indulgence. The ritual renewals kept the covenant legible to new actors. Trustees could be replaced without altering the core commitments. Terms could be amended with transparency rather than surreptitious enrichment. The envelope, folded into its corner, continued to be less a legal weapon than a family's map for navigating reciprocity across time and crisis. The civic experiments in our neighborhood had also matured into modest networks. By 2025, there were 3 community centers that used our model as a starting point for small, low-bureaucracy forms of aid. These centers shared templates for written agreements, trained volunteers in compassionate enforcement, and ran monthly clinics where families could draft covenants with the help of pro bono lawyers. The scale was still small. The logic that had guided us, pragmatic humility, ritualized aid, and legible limits, remained intentionally non-duplicative. We resisted the temptation to systematize at scale for fear of ossifying an ethic into a program. Instead, we cultivated a distributed practice that could be adapted locally. In quieter moments, I still return to the envelope and think about the moral paradox at the heart of our experiment. The act that in March 2004 felt like a radical boundary, a paper that could be read in some circles as disownment, has turned, over 2 decades, into an instrument of entangled care. What once might have been called a refusal has become a frame for a particular kind of fidelity: fidelity to a household's survival, fidelity to the dignity of those who receive aid, and fidelity to the possibility that generosity without limits often destroys the very thing it intends to protect. Each amendment, each ceremony, each account of someone who recovered the capacity to support themselves, argues for restraint as a form of love. And yet restraint itself can be misperceived as calcification. We remain vigilant not to turn mercy into rule. The story remains unfinished. There are plans we have not yet tried: a rotating neighbor labor bank, a small scholarship for young bakers apprenticing in the shop, and a draft clause that would permit the bakery to provide microloans to those establishing housing or launching small enterprises. We have sketched these ideas in meetings during 2024 and 2025 and have left space in the ledger for pilot funds. The envelope will be consulted again, its margins still bearing that faint smudge. When we next sit at the kitchen table to revise its language, we will do so with the patience of people who have lived through several cycles of crisis and repair. We will read aloud as we have done before, and we will invite the same kind of witnesses. Neighbors who have both benefited and contributed, the trustee who keeps the minutes, and the child who now balances the books. The ritual of rereading will make the work of saying no precise and the work of saying yes accountable, and it will, I hope, continue to preserve dignity even as it limits harm. We began 2026 with a ledger entry rather than a manifesto. On January 8, 2026, after the holiday lull, the bakery's back office recorded an initial outlay of $400, flyers, a small stipend for a coordinator, and a used tablet to manage sign-ups. The item was labeled in the margin Neighbor Labor Bank Pilot. The line looked humble, almost apologetic, and that humility was intentional. We wanted a proof of concept that could be accounted for on a napkin as easily as in a grant application. The pilot launched on February 14, 2026, chosen partly for irony and partly because so many people were already accustomed to gathering on that date. 12 households signed up in the first month. The bank operated on a simple rule: 1 hour of neighbor labor earned 1 labor credit, which could be spent on another neighbor's hour of help, groceries, childcare, a ride to a clinic. We added a clause to the covenant: labor credits could not be converted into cash, transferred without consent, or hoarded for more than 12 months. The covenant, still ceremonially read at each intake, framed the labor bank as both a mutual aid and an accountability device. We are not rescuers, the line said, we are guarantors of reciprocity. By June 2026, the pilot had grown to 40 households. The ledger recorded dozens of small exchanges. A retired carpenter fixing a sagging fence for a single mother in return for 2 nights of groceries prepared by a local chef. The trustee instituted an online calendar, and the tablet purchased in January, its password held with the envelope's digital clause, became the modest backbone of coordination. People who used to cross the street rather than ask for help now left notes on the bakery counter requesting a single hour of labor credit assistance. The ritual of asking, of stating need aloud in the presence of witnesses, remained central. Many cited the covenant's language as the mechanism that made those admissions bearable. The paper insisted that need be named without shaming, and that aid be finite. The scholarship fund for young bakers, which we had sketched in 2024 and left as a ledger item, was formalized in September 2026. It began with 3 modest awards, each $2,000, intended to pay for apprenticeships, equipment, and the time it takes to learn a trade. We wrote a clause into the covenant that permitted the bakery to reserve a percentage of monthly profits for the scholarship. The trustee, the child who now kept the books, oversaw the awards. The first recipient was a 19-year-old who had been baking at the shop for 2 years and who planned to open a small stall selling morning buns at the Saturday market. The scholarship was both symbolic and practical. It created a new lineage for the trade and provided a structured opportunity to reinvest in the community's future. Microloans, which our ledger had left as an open question, were piloted in March 2027. The bakery partnered with 2 of the neighborhood centers, one that had been using our covenant model since 2025 and a newer one that opened in late 2026, to underwrite small, short-term loans for housing repairs and startup expenses. The terms were strict. Loans never exceeded $3,000, they required a repayment plan of no more than 24 months, and they included mandatory follow-up meetings every 3 months. The loans were less an entrepreneurial gambit than a pragmatic bridge: a new roof, a deposit for a modest rental, a set of tools that allowed someone to turn a craft into steady work. The trustee insisted on collateral in the form of labor credits or small wage garnishments only where the borrower agreed. We refused to take houses or essential possessions. Not all pilots succeeded. The Neighbor Labor Bank struggled with enforcement in summer 2027 when a household that had accrued 28 hours of credit fell behind on reciprocity. The trustees convened a review. We could have dissolved the household's credits, written them off with the same casual cruelty we had all once feared, but instead we instituted a restorative plan. The household would engage in a public apprenticeship, teaching a skill learned at the bakery, until the credits were repaid. The public apprenticeship was awkward at first. It forced the household to show up where they had previously withdrawn. But it also recalibrated the community's moral economy. The ledger plainly recorded the result. The household repaid the ledger hours and, more importantly, rejoined neighborhood rituals. The envelope continued to sit in its box during these years, but its influence widened in ways that surprised me. In March 2027, a city council member referenced our model during a budget hearing on eldercare, not to propose wholesale adoption but to argue for pilot-level partnerships between municipal services and community covenants. The reference was cautious, hedged with worries about accountability and equity, but it signaled a new kind of legitimacy, a recognition that the practices we had developed in a small bakery were legible to municipal policymakers as potential complements to formal social services. This attention brought new scrutiny. An op-ed in a regional paper in April 2027 accused our network of substituting private moral judgment for public obligation. A few days of judgment followed, editorial panels, heated letters to the paper. Yet the critiques also forced a necessary clarification in our own documents. We drafted a short appendix on the covenant's relationship to public benefits. How private aid would never be used to supplant entitlements, how trustees would maintain strict non-displacement protocols, how every aid decision would be recorded and made available to the recipient on request. Perhaps the most consequential test of the covenant's ethics, however, was not political but personal. In August 2027, the surviving parent who had once called in the night, whose voice had begged us to abolish the forms, fell ill. The illness was not sudden, it was the cumulative wear of decades. We had, over the years, preserved a clause that allowed for short-term exceptions tied to mutual contribution. This clause was invoked. The surviving parent asked for assistance beyond the limits we had previously set. Assistance that included a live-in aid for 3 months, help with home modifications, and a small stipend to offset medical travel. There was a heated family meeting on August 17, 2027. The trustee recorded minutes like a court stenographer. I read aloud the history of our decisions, the amendment rituals, and the rationale that restraint had saved the bakery and a dozen households from ruin. The surviving parent, in turn, read aloud a different history, years of discomfort, the cost of pride, the unrefrigerated meals of youth, the quiet resignation of a person worn thin by the erosion of agency. We reached a compromise on August 19. The assistance would be provided, but it would be paired with a structured program, 3 weekly volunteer hours in the elders group, participation in a neighborhood storytelling project, and a commitment to a telemedicine schedule that the trustee monitored. The clause required quarterly reviews and stipulated that any continuation beyond 6 months would need a formal vote among those who had contributed to the extraordinary fund. The decision felt like the covenant's heart compressed into a single moment. Love expressed through constraint, and constraint expressed through an expanded notion of dignity. The surviving parent's health improved with the combined support, and in November 2027, the elder joined the storytelling project. At the first session, she read an account of the dinner years before that had given the family its original rupture. She described handing what she called the paper to her child, words she had not had the courage to say aloud, and wanting distance as much as protection. The envelope she had pushed away, she confessed, later became the language she learned to ask with. There was a sobbing silence in the room when she finished. It felt like the covenant absorbing the original wound and returning it, softened, as testimony. Throughout 2027 and into 2028, the neighborhood centers multiplied in number. From 3 centers in 2025 to 5 by May 2028, these spaces remained intentionally small, lightly staffed, and networked through the ledger rather than institutionalized hierarchies. They exchanged templates, held monthly convenings, and posted minutes publicly so that any member could contest decisions. The roughly 500 small transactions we recorded in 2027, loans, labor exchanges, scholarships, and exceptions, were catalogued and analyzed in quarterly reviews. The data was not used to centralize power, it was used to reveal patterns of need and to argue for modest municipal supports that complemented, rather than supplanted, public systems. In March 2028, we agreed to grant a visiting fellowship to a scholar interested in the anthropology of care economies. The fellowship required that the scholar live in the neighborhood for 6 months and participate in the monthly review meetings. The scholar's notes, later published in a short essay in October 2028, described our covenant as a vernacular constitution, a set of written and unwritten rules that governed solidarity without dissolving it into charity. The essay brought more attention. There were invitations to speak at conferences and an offer from a national nonprofit to help scale the model. We declined the scaling offer. The refusal was practical and ethical. Scaling, as we had argued for nearly 2 decades, risked ossifying a flexible practice into a bureaucratic form that would likely reproduce the same harms we hoped to avoid. The ledger continued to accumulate marginalia. On September 2, 2028, an entry recorded a dispute over a microloan to a small tailoring enterprise. The borrower had failed to make 2 repayments due to a sudden drop in orders after a competing chain opened nearby. The trustees revised the repayment schedule and paired the borrower with a marketing mentor from the Labour Bank. On October 20, 2028, the borrower posted an update. Sales were picking up, and the business had hired an apprentice using a scholarship fund. These microhistories, when read together, began to shape a richer narrative than any single success or failure, a slow accretion of capacity that moved through households like a current. My own role shifted in this period from organizer to witness and archivist. I spent less time behind the counter and more time at the long table in the bakery's back room, where minutes were taken and promises were registered. The trustee, who had once served as a part-time social worker, became the central custodian of the ledger and the envelope. The child, now in their late 20s, handled finances and outreach. The ritual renewals of the envelope that had once been annual had become biennial by 2028. The smudge in the margin remained, now a small fragment of blue ink like a scar that everyone recognized. We continued to invite neighbors as witnesses and to bake a plain chocolate cake for the ceremony. The moral dilemmas persisted. A new form of pressure arrived in late 2028 from a neighborhood development project that promised improved transit but also threatened rising rents. The covenant did not have a provision for market displacement. Its protections were household level, not systemic. We convened emergency meetings in November and December 2028 and drafted a mitigation clause, a small escalator fund that would provide emergency housing subsidies to those displaced while they used labor credits and scholarships to re-establish themselves. The escalator fund was funded by a surcharge we added to some large catering orders the bakery received, a modest market solution to a structural problem. The trustee notified contributors of the surcharge. 3 of the neighborhood centers agreed to match the fund's first year. Outside the ledger, criticism continued to shadow a claim. Some argued that our model allowed localities to abdicate responsibility for affordable housing and elder care. These critiques were salutary. They forced us to lobby at the city council level in early 2029, to argue not for replacement but for partnership. We proposed a pilot program that would integrate community covenants into the city's emergency rental assistance program in a way that respected entitlements and used private aid as gap coverage. The council approved a small pilot in March 2029 with clear guardrails: no displacement of benefits, transparency requirements, and quarterly audits. By mid-2029, the practices we had cultivated in the bakery had spread into informal networks that connected 3 neighboring districts. There was, in the ledger, a sense not of triumph but of a cautious expansion, more codified rituals, more careful record-keeping, and a steady insistence that reciprocity be honored. The envelope had not become a panacea, it had become a slow, stubborn technology for living together. It had taught us that boundaries could be instruments of compassion and that compassion without limits could erode the capacities it sought to sustain. The story, as always, was messy and ongoing. There were days when we failed our own standards. There were other days when an hour of labor changed the shape of a life. The covenant's language had matured from the defensive note it had once been, what some had called at that first dinner a paper of disownment, to a living instrument that made awkward conversations possible, that required us to name limits, and that compelled us to imagine new forms of mutual aid. We still did not have answers for every crisis: large-scale displacement, chronic illness requiring long-term institutional care, the slow attrition of public goods under pressure. But the practices we had developed, ritual renewal, transparent minutes, paired exceptions, and an ethic that valued the survival of households as a precondition for generosity, continued to function as a civic grammar. In late 2029, as the decade turned and the ledger reached a new volume, we planned another revision of the envelope.